In 1977, two aircrafts collided on a runway in Tenerife Airport. You may be wondering what led to this disaster. You see, it was a Friday, March 27, 1977, when a series of events set into motion the deadliest aviation disaster in history. It all started at Gran Canaria Airport, the main international airport on the Spanish Canary island of Gran Canaria. The weather was sunny and the skies were clear, but the course of the day would change quickly. At 5 p.m., a bomb explosion occurred in the airport's terminal. It was a terrorist act carried out by the separatist group, the Canary Islands Independence Movement. This bombing caused significant damage to the terminal and sent shockwaves through the airport. All incoming flights were quickly diverted to nearby Tenerife Airport on the neighboring island of Tenerife, a smaller and less busy airport. This diversion of traffic led to an unusual situation that would soon lead to disaster. In response to the sudden influx of diverted aircraft, the air traffic controllers at Tenerife struggled to manage the growing congestion at their airport. Tenerife Airport had a single runway, which would soon be shared by multiple international flights. There were no indications yet that the situation would escalate, but the flight crews and air traffic controllers were unaware of the chaos that was about to unfold. Among the diverted aircraft was a KLM Royal Dutch Airlines Boeing 747 flight, KLM Flight 4805, arriving from Amsterdam with 248 passengers and crew aboard. The KLM aircraft, a wide-bodied jet, was one of the largest planes of its time. The aircraft's captain, Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, was an experienced pilot with over 11,000 flying hours, including experience on the Boeing 747. He was accompanied by his first officer, Kees Slaar, and a flight engineer, Jan de Vries. Also diverted to Tenerife was Pan American World Airways, Pan Am, Flight 1736, a Boeing 747 with 396 passengers and crew. The flight had originated from Los Angeles with a stopover in New York. Pan Am Flight 1736 was commanded by Captain Victor Grubbs, who had over 20 years of flying experience. His first officer was Robert Bragg, and his flight engineer was Edward J. Borman. After the explosion and subsequent evacuation at Gran Canaria, all flights were forced to circle and wait for clearance to land at Tenerife. As the planes started arriving, air traffic controllers on the ground became overwhelmed. The runway became congested with planes, all seeking to disembark or get clearance to take off. A number of planes were directed to the single runway at Tenerife's Los Rodeos Airport, with instructions to taxi to the far end of the runway. At 5:15 p.m., KLM Flight 4805, with Captain Veldhuizen van Zanten in command, landed at Tenerife, followed shortly by Pan Am Flight 1736. Both planes taxied towards the runway, where they would await clearance to take off. This created a potentially dangerous situation, as the runway, which was the only one in use, was filling up quickly. Visibility at the airport had been clear upon arrival, but as the planes began to taxi and wait for instructions, a dense fog began to roll in. By 5:15 p.m., the visibility was reduced to only about 100 meters, and it would only continue to worsen. This dense fog, combined with the number of planes on the runway, would soon prove to be a disastrous combination. Air traffic controllers struggled to manage the growing confusion. Tenerife Airport's single runway was meant to handle a much smaller number of aircraft, not the crowded scene it now hosted. The planes were instructed to taxi down the runway and wait for their turn to take off. The Pan Am flight, which had arrived after the KLM flight, was instructed to move into position and wait. The KLM flight, however, had already been cleared for takeoff. At 5:17 p.m., KLM Flight 4805 was given the go-ahead to take off from the runway. Captain Van Zanten, who had been waiting anxiously to depart, assumed that the Pan Am aircraft, which was still taxiing, had been cleared off the runway. There was no clear communication from the air traffic control tower confirming that the runway was clear for takeoff. However, the air traffic controllers failed to explicitly inform Van Zanten of the location of the Pan Am plane. Miscommunication between the flight crews and the air traffic control tower began to escalate. The tower instructed KLM to take off, but the pilots were unaware that Pan Am was still occupying part of the runway. The tower also failed to clarify the exact position of the Pan Am flight, leaving the KLM crew with an incomplete understanding of the situation. KLM Flight 4805 had received clearance to take off, but the Pan Am flight, which was still taxiing down the runway, had not yet been given clearance to exit the runway. Pan Am Flight 1736, now on the runway, was moving slowly ahead, not yet cleared to take off, but maneuvering to position itself for departure. At the same time, KLM Flight 4805, with Captain Van Zanten at the helm, began its takeoff roll down the same runway. The dense fog made it impossible for either crew to visually spot the other aircraft in time. As KLM began its takeoff, Pan Am's flight crew realized that the KLM plane was speeding down the runway in their direction. Captain Grubbs of Pan Am immediately shouted at his flight crew to cut power and attempted to move the Pan Am aircraft off the runway. However, it was too late. At exactly 5:19 p.m., KLM Flight 4805 reached a speed fast enough for takeoff, but the pilots could no longer stop the aircraft in time to avoid the Pan Am plane. The two aircraft collided with a massive explosion of flames and debris. The KLM Boeing 747 crashed into the fuselage of the Pan Am plane, instantly killing all 248 passengers and crew members on board KLM Flight 4805. The Pan Am aircraft, struck by the impact of the collision, immediately caught fire. The explosion was so intense that much of the Pan Am plane's fuselage was destroyed. There were a few survivors, but the overwhelming majority of the 396 passengers and crew members aboard Pan Am Flight 1736 perished as well. The smoke and flames from the collision rose high above the runway. Rescue crews rushed to the scene, but the inferno was already too fierce. As firefighters battled the flames, they discovered the enormity of the disaster. The runway, once a hub of frantic activity, was now a scene of unimaginable devastation. A total of 583 people lost their lives that day, and only 61 people from the Pan Am flight survived. It would take hours for the wreckage to be cleared, and the survivors of the disaster were left to try and comprehend the horror of what had just occurred. The investigation into the disaster found that a series of human errors, miscommunications, and misinterpretations of instructions led directly to the fatal collision. The fog had made it difficult for both flight crews to see each other, and the air traffic controllers had failed to properly communicate the positions of both planes. The KLM flight's captain, too eager to depart, had misunderstood the tower's instructions and assumed that the runway was clear. The air traffic control tower had not sufficiently clarified the situation, and in a moment of chaos, the result was a catastrophic tragedy. The disaster also brought about significant changes to international aviation procedures. It highlighted the need for improved communication, particularly in situations involving multiple aircraft on the same runway. The events at Tenerife led to sweeping reforms in cockpit communication protocols, including the development of standardized phraseology and procedures for pilots and air traffic controllers. These measures, which are still in use today, have made aviation safer, ensuring that a tragedy of this magnitude will never happen again. As the years have passed, the Tenerife disaster has remained a somber reminder of the dangers that can result from simple misunderstandings, poor communication, and human error. The lives lost on that fateful day serve as a powerful legacy, driving forward improvements in the way aviation operates. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe for more Headliner stories.